The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. The heat of the Fresno summer clung to the walls, but inside, no one dared to move, no one dared to breathe too loudly. Every eye in the room was fixed on the man sitting high above them, the man who held the power to decide another's fate. Judge Malcolm Brewer sat tall, his face carved from stone, betraying no emotion. He had been on the bench for 35 years, long enough to see thousands of cases, long enough to know that justice was rarely clean. He was known for being firm, decisive, a man who never wavered. Mercy was not his reputation, efficiency was. And today would be no different. At the defense table, Ryan Hale stood motionless, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden surface as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His eyes were steady, though his fingers trembled slightly. He was just 24, but the weight of the moment made him look older, as if the life had been drained out of him in the weeks leading up to this day. He had pleaded his innocence from the moment of his arrest. He had repeated the same words to anyone who would listen. I didn't do it. But no one had listened. The jury had reached their verdict, and now it was time for the final blow. The silence was suffocating as Judge Brewer cleared his throat, his deep voice reverberating through the room. Mr. Hale, he began, his tone even unreadable. You stand before this court convicted by a jury of your peers. The crimes committed have caused irreparable harm to this community. Your actions were reckless, calculated, and shown no sign of remorse. A quiet sob broke the stillness. Ryan's mother, seated in the back row, clutched a tissue to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. She had begged for leniency, for someone to see her son as more than just a case file. But the courtroom did not see mothers. It did not see sons. It only saw facts. And the facts, as presented, were damning. Judge Brewer's voice did not waver. I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison. The gavel struck the oak block with a sharp, resounding crack. The decision was final. For a moment, Ryan did not move. He simply closed his eyes, pressing his lips together as if willing himself not to speak. But there was nothing left to say. The verdict had spoken louder than he ever could. The room erupted into a frenzy, gasps, whispers, the hurried scribbling of reporters capturing the moment in ink. But for Ryan, the world had gone silent. As the bailiff stepped forward, his wrists were cuffed in front of him, cold steel biting against his skin. He turned, scanning the room, until his eyes found his mother. She was standing now, her face pale, her expression pleading as if she could will him free with nothing more than a mother's love. He gave her a small nod, a silent promise, stay strong. And then he was led away, his shackled footsteps echoing down the long corridor. Back in his chambers, Judge Brewer exhaled deeply and shut the door behind him, shutting out the noise, shutting out the weight of the room. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the black liquid swirling in his cup as he stared into it, lost in thought. It had been a long day, but justice had been served. At least, that was what he told himself. He had done his job. He had followed the law. And yet, as he sat at his desk, something unsettled him, a flicker of doubt, small and unwelcome. He dismissed it, chalking it up to exhaustion. But what Judge Brewer didn't know was that the truth he had just buried would soon claw its way back to the surface. And it would change everything. The crime had shaken the city of Fresno to its core. Carter's Jewelers, one of the most well-known stores downtown, had been hit in broad daylight. The masked gunman had stormed in on a Thursday afternoon, his weapon drawn, sending terrified customers and employees diving for cover. Surveillance footage later showed the suspect moving quickly and methodically, sweeping expensive watches and diamond rings into a black duffel bag. Then, just as he was making his escape, shots were fired. By the time the chaos settled, one of the store clerks, Samuel Gaines, was lying in a pool of his own blood, fighting for his life. The thief had disappeared without a trace, vanishing into the crowded streets before the police could respond. It was the kind of crime that made headlines for weeks, the kind that had people locking their doors and looking over their shoulders. Authorities were under pressure to make an arrest, and soon, they got exactly what they needed. 2 weeks after the robbery, an anonymous tip came in. The caller claimed to have seen a man fleeing the crime scene, and according to them, that man was Ryan Hale. The police moved swiftly. Ryan was arrested at his job, a small auto shop where he worked as a mechanic. He had grease on his hands, a look of confusion on his face, and no idea why officers were suddenly surrounding him. At the station, they laid out the evidence. A grainy surveillance video showed a man of similar build running from a store. Eyewitnesses swore they recognized Ryan's voice from the scene. But the most damning piece of all was the fingerprints found on the weapon left behind. A weapon authorities said matched the one used in the robbery. Ryan shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "I didn't do this," he said over and over. "I wasn't anywhere near that store." But the officers weren't listening. They already had their suspect. When Ryan asked for a lawyer, he was assigned a public defender, an overworked man who barely had time to review his case before the trial began. It didn't matter that Ryan had an alibi, that he had been at work the entire day. His boss, when called to testify, could only confirm that Ryan had been there for part of his shift, but couldn't say for certain where he was at the time of the robbery. That single gap in his alibi was all the prosecution needed. The trial was swift. The district attorney painted a picture of a young man who had carefully planned the robbery, someone who thought he was smart enough to outmaneuver the system, but had left behind enough evidence to seal his fate. "The fingerprints don't lie," the DA said to the jury. "The security footage doesn't lie. The witnesses don't lie." Ryan's lawyer tried to push back, but his arguments were weak. There were too many holes, too much doubt, but the defense didn't have the resources to fight it. "Members of the jury," the lawyer pleaded in his closing statement, "there are too many unanswered questions in this case. You cannot, in good conscience, convict a man when doubt still remains." But his words carried no weight. Less than 3 hours later, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Ryan didn't flinch when he heard it. He sat there, jaw tight, hands clenched, as if he had expected this all along. Judge Brewer watched him carefully. He had seen hardened criminals before, men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of deception. To him, Ryan was no different. He saw no remorse in the young man's eyes, no regret for what had happened. And so, when it came time to deliver the sentence, Brewer did not hesitate. "You have caused irreparable harm to this community," he told Ryan. "You have shown no remorse for your actions. This court finds no reason to offer leniency." He paused for only a brief moment before delivering the final blow. "I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison." The gavel struck wood, the sharp crack cutting through the heavy silence of the courtroom. Ryan sat still, his expression unreadable. But in the back of the room, his mother let out a choked sob. The sentence was final. As the bailiffs approached, Ryan turned one last time, his gaze locking onto his mother's. There were no words exchanged between them, only a look, one filled with 1,000 unspoken things. Then he was led away. Judge Brewer watched as the doors closed behind him, sealing his fate. Another case closed. Another name added to the long list of criminals who had passed through his courtroom. He returned to his chambers and poured himself a cup of coffee, staring into the dark liquid as if it held some kind of answer. It had been a long day, but justice had been served. Or at least, that was what he told himself. And yet, somewhere deep in his mind, a thought lingered, small, quiet, barely more than a whisper. What if I was wrong? But he pushed it aside, dismissing it as nothing more than exhaustion. What Judge Brewer didn't realize was that the truth, the very truth he had just sentenced to die, was about to rise again, and it would change everything. Judge Malcolm Brewer sat in his study, the warm glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the stacks of case files and legal briefs. It had been a long day, longer than most, but retirement had been on his mind lately, and he figured a few more late nights wouldn't make much difference. The routine was familiar. Pour a cup of coffee, flip through reports, sign off on paperwork that would soon be filed away and forgotten. But tonight, something caught his eye. He was reviewing a case about alleged police misconduct when an evidence log from a prior investigation landed in his hands. His gaze skimmed over the list of confiscated items, stolen goods, drug paraphernalia, firearms, until something stopped him cold. A gun, the serial number, the description, the scratches on the barrel. It was the same gun used in the Carter's jeweler's robbery, the very case he had sentenced Ryan Hale for. But there was one glaring, impossible detail. This gun had been seized by police 2 days after the robbery. Brewer's breath caught in his throat. That meant one of two things. Either someone had put a duplicate gun in Ryan Hale's hands, an unlikely coincidence, or the weapon used in the crime had never actually been in his possession to begin with. He leaned forward, flipping through the documents again, this time more carefully. The more he read, the more his stomach churned. The gun had been booked into evidence by an officer from an entirely different investigation. That meant it had been in police custody before it was ever presented as evidence against Ryan. But that didn't make sense. He pressed his fingers against his temple, forcing himself to think through the implications. If this gun had been secured by authorities after the crime, then the prosecution's most damning piece of evidence, the fingerprints found on the weapon, had to be fabricated. Ryan had told the truth. Brewer swallowed hard. He had sentenced an innocent man. His fingers tightened around the edges of the report as a slow, creeping horror spread through his chest. He had seen wrongful convictions before, heard about evidence being mishandled, but never had he been the one to hand down the sentence. He sat in silence for several moments, the only sound in the room the distant ticking of a clock. Then, he picked up his pen and underlined a name in the case report. Detective Lewis, the lead investigator in Ryan's trial. Brewer didn't like coincidences, and this was too big to ignore. The case against Ryan had leaned heavily on an anonymous tip, a tip that had conveniently placed him at the scene. But if the gun was false evidence, what were the chances that the tip had been? 2. He turned back to the case file and found a record of the call. The number had been untraceable during the trial, dismissed as a burner phone with no way to identify the caller. But now, with more resources at his disposal, Brewer requested a full record search. It took less than an hour. The call hadn't come from a random citizen. It had come from a phone registered under Detective Lewis's name. Brewer pushed back from his desk, his pulse hammering in his ears. Lewis had fabricated evidence. He had orchestrated the arrest. He had built an entire case around a lie. And Brewer had handed down a 60-year sentence based on it. The weight of that realization settled over him like a crushing force. For the first time in his career, he felt something close to fear, not for himself, but for the truth. If he pursued this, if he questioned the system he had spent decades upholding, it wouldn't just be Ryan Hale's case that unraveled. It would be everything. His career, his reputation, maybe even his safety. But then he thought of Ryan, sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit, paying the price for Brewer's own blind faith in the system. No, this wasn't about his career. This wasn't about his reputation. This was about justice. And for the first time in 35 years, Judge Malcolm Brewer realized that justice had not been served. It had been buried, and now he was going to dig it back up. Judge Malcolm Brewer knew he couldn't do this alone. The walls of his office seemed to close in around him as he stared at the damning evidence in front of him. The falsified reports, the phone records linking Detective Lewis to the anonymous tip, the inconsistencies in the case against Ryan Hale. The truth was right there, waiting to be uncovered. But uncovering it meant going up against a system that had spent years perfecting the art of burying its mistakes. There was only one person he trusted to help him navigate this. Daniel Hayes, a retired investigator. Hayes had spent decades working internal affairs, rooting out corruption from within the department. He had made enemies, been forced into early retirement, but his reputation remained intact. He was one of the few men in law enforcement who couldn't be bought. Brewer called him that same night. "You wouldn't have called me if this wasn't serious," Hayes said, his voice gravelly from years of whiskey and late nights. "It's bad," Brewer admitted. "Real bad." They met at a diner off Highway 99, a place where no one would think to look for them. Hayes, dressed in a worn leather jacket, leaned back in his chair as Brewer laid out everything. The gun, the phone records, the mounting evidence that Ryan Hale had been framed. Hayes listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Brewer finally finished, the older man exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. "This isn't just negligence," he said, pushing his coffee mug aside. "This was orchestrated." Brewer nodded grimly. and Lewis was at the center of it. Hayes leaned forward. If Lewis planted evidence and manipulated witnesses, then that means someone higher up signed off on it. He wouldn't risk something like this unless he knew he was protected. The thought sent a chill through Brewer. If Lewis had done this once, how many other cases had he tainted? How many innocent men were sitting in prison because of his lies? They spent the next few days combing through case files, searching for patterns. What they found made Brewer's stomach turn. Reports that had been altered, witness testimonies that had been changed, evidence that had conveniently gone missing when cases got too complicated. And then, the breakthrough. The original witness statement from the Carter's Jewelers robbery. A store employee had initially identified a different suspect. Someone taller, bulkier, a man with a distinct tattoo on his left wrist. But that statement had never made it to court. Instead, a revised version had been submitted, this time identifying Ryan Hale. Brewer and Hayes tracked down the clerk, a man named Jesse Whitman, who now worked at a gas station on the outskirts of town. When they found him, he looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "I already told the cops everything," Jesse muttered, stacking boxes behind the counter. "You told them one thing," Hayes corrected, "and then you told them something else. We want to know why." Jesse hesitated. Brewer took a step forward. "You were the first person to see the shooter up close. You identified someone else. But when the trial came, your statement had changed. We need the truth." Jesse wiped his hands on his jeans, his shoulders tense. "I didn't want to," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "But Detective Lewis, he came to me, said I must have been mistaken, that if I didn't say it was Ryan Hale, they'd find a way to charge me with obstruction." His hands trembled. "I got scared." Brewer exchanged a look with Hayes. It was worse than they thought. Not only had Lewis fabricated evidence, but he had coerced a witness into changing his testimony. It still wasn't enough. They needed something indisputable, something that would force the system to take action. And that was when Hayes found the video. Buried deep in the records was a piece of security footage that had never been submitted during Ryan's trial. It came from a parking lot security camera near Carter's Jewelers, captured just minutes after the robbery. The grainy footage showed a man walking swiftly toward an unmarked sedan, a black duffel bag clutched in his hand. It wasn't Ryan Hale. It was Detective Lewis. Brewer's blood ran cold as he watched the clip on Hayes' laptop. There was no mistaking it. Lewis, the lead detective on the case, the same man who had built the prosecution's argument against Ryan Hale, was caught on camera leaving the scene of the crime with a bag full of stolen jewelry. It changed everything. Brewer shut the laptop, his hands steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "This isn't just a wrongful conviction," he said quietly. "This is a setup, and we're about to blow it wide open." Judge Malcolm Brewer knew what had to be done. The moment he and Hayes uncovered the security footage of Detective Lewis walking away from the scene of the crime with a bag full of stolen jewelry, there was no turning back. The truth was no longer just a suspicion. It was undeniable. Brewer wasted no time. He filed a formal motion to reopen Ryan Hale's case, citing new and irrefutable evidence of corruption and misconduct. At the same time, he compiled every document, every altered report, every coerced statement, and every shred of proof they had found and submitted it directly to the Department of Justice. Once the motion was made public, the storm hit. News outlets seized the story, broadcasting headlines that sent shockwaves through the legal community. Fresno judge reopens case amid allegations of police corruption. New evidence suggests convicted man may be innocent, and the real criminal is a cop. The public was in an uproar. People who had never even heard of Ryan Hale before now demanded justice. Civil rights organizations called for immediate action. The pressure was mounting by the hour, but not everyone saw Brewer as a hero. Within days, the backlash began. Colleagues he had worked with for years suddenly stopped returning his calls. Friends in the legal system distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the fallout of what was shaping up to be one of the biggest scandals in Fresno's history. And then came the threats. They started as anonymous phone calls. At first, just silence on the other end of the line. Then, a low voice muttering warnings. "Drop it, Judge. Walk away." Then his tires were slashed. His mailbox was smashed in. A brick was thrown through his window late one night, shattering glass across his living room floor. The message was clear: stop, or else. Brewer sat in the wreckage of his home, his heart pounding, his fists clenched. He had spent decades upholding the law, believing in the system. But now, that very system was trying to silence him. He wasn't going to let them. Not this time. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras flashing as Brewer took his seat. Across the room, Ryan Hale sat in his prison jumpsuit, thinner than before but sitting tall, his eyes fixed straight ahead. At the front, Detective Lewis stood with his attorney, his expression unreadable. But Brewer could see it, the tightness in his jaw, the flicker of unease behind his eyes. He knew what was coming. The judge presiding over the hearing gave Brewer the floor. He stood, his voice steady, his years of courtroom experience anchoring him. "Your Honor," he began, "this court was led to believe that Ryan Hale was guilty of armed robbery and attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, forensic proof, a confession made under legal counsel." A pause. "But what if I told you that every single piece of evidence used in this case was manipulated? That the witnesses were threatened, the forensic proof was fabricated, and that the very officer who built this case, Detective Lewis, was not just responsible for a wrongful conviction, but was the real perpetrator of this crime?" The courtroom erupted into murmurs, whispers of disbelief rippling through the crowd. Brewer gestured to the court clerk. The lights dimmed slightly as the security footage played on the screen at the front of the room. The grainy video showed a man exiting a building just minutes after the robbery. He walked quickly, avoiding eye contact, carrying a black duffel bag filled with stolen jewelry. He glanced over his shoulder before getting into an unmarked car. The camera zoomed in. The entire courtroom gasped. It was Detective Lewis. A heavy silence fell over the room. The weight of what they had just seen hung in the air like a thick fog. Across the room, Lewis's face drained of color. His lawyer whispered something furiously in his ear, but it was too late. "Your Honor," Brewer continued, "this is the man who not only investigated Ryan Hale, but also testified against him. This is the man who planted evidence, fabricated statements, and ensured an innocent man went to prison for a crime he did not commit." The presiding judge sat back, exhaling sharply. "Does the prosecution have anything to say?" The district attorney stood, shifting uncomfortably. "Given the new evidence, we have no choice but to recommend the immediate overturning of Ryan Hale's conviction." Ryan's mother let out a choked sob. Brewer turned his gaze to Ryan, who sat frozen in his seat, as if afraid to believe what he had just heard. Then, the words that changed everything. "Ryan Hale," the judge announced, "you are hereby declared a free man." The courtroom exploded in applause, reporters scrambling to capture the moment, people rising to their feet as Ryan dropped his head into his hands. Brewer watched as Ryan's mother rushed forward, pulling her son into the tightest embrace she had ever given him. It was over, or at least this part was. As officers stepped forward, placing Detective Lewis in handcuffs, Brewer caught the man's eyes one last time. "You don't know what you've started," Lewis hissed. Brewer held his gaze. "Yes, I do," he said. "I started justice." The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. The moment the courtroom doors swung open after Ryan Hale's exoneration, the story spread like wildfire. Headlines flashed across every major news outlet. Anchors spoke in urgent tones, and social media erupted with outrage. A broken system. How an innocent man spent years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Detective exposed. How a corrupt cop framed an innocent man. Judge Brewer takes a stand. The case that could change everything. The entire country was watching. Ryan's wrongful conviction wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger disease, a justice system that had allowed men like Detective Lewis to operate unchecked. Now, that system was cracking under the weight of its own corruption. Investigations were launched. Cases Lewis had worked on were pulled from dusty files and examined under a new, unforgiving light. Some convictions were overturned, others were thrown into question. The Fresno Police Department found itself at the center of a firestorm, forced to answer for its failures. And Detective Lewis? He wasn't just disgraced. He was arrested, charged with multiple counts of evidence tampering, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and perjury. The very system he had manipulated for years was now turning against him. But while the world focused on the downfall of a corrupt officer, another story was unfolding, one that mattered even more. Ryan Hale, once branded a criminal, was now a free man. The first few days after his release felt surreal. The sky looked different. The air smelled different. Even the simple act of walking down the street without shackles around his wrists felt foreign. He had spent years waking up behind concrete walls, hearing metal doors clang shut behind him. Now he stood in the open, no bars, no chains, just possibility stretching out before him. But freedom came with a heavy burden. People asked him if he was angry, if he wanted revenge, if he resented the years that had been stolen from him. And the truth was, he had been angry. In those long nights, locked away for something he hadn't done, he had let the anger consume him. But anger was a fire that never satisfied. It only left ashes. Ryan didn't want ashes. He wanted change. So he made a decision. Instead of letting the past break him, he would use it to build something better. He dedicated himself to helping others who had been wrongfully convicted, becoming a fierce advocate for justice reform. He spoke at universities, met with lawmakers, and worked with organizations that fought for those who had no voice. Because he knew what it was like to be silenced, and he refused to let it happen to anyone else. As for Judge Brewer, he had spent most of his career believing in the system, trusting that justice was absolute. But this case had changed him. He could no longer be the man who blindly followed the rules, assuming they were fair. Justice wasn't a machine. It wasn't a set of laws written in stone. Justice was a fight, and it required people willing to stand up, willing to push back, willing to risk everything to uncover the truth. Some call him a hero. Others called him a traitor. But Brewer didn't care. He knew he had done the right thing. He knew he would spend the rest of his career fighting to make sure another Ryan Hale never happened again. Because the truth was simple. The justice system wasn't perfect. It made mistakes. It was flawed, but it could be better. And it would be, if enough people had the courage to demand it. If this story has moved you, if it has made you question the world we live in, consider supporting organizations that fight for the wrongfully convicted. Because justice isn't just something that happens in a courtroom. It's something we must all fight for. Justice is not a destination. It is a battle, a relentless fight waged by those willing to stand against the tide, even when the world tells them to stay silent. Ryan Hale's story did not end the day he walked free. It was only the beginning. His name would forever be a reminder of how fragile justice could be, how easily it could be manipulated, twisted, and used as a weapon against the innocent. But it would also be a reminder of something far greater, the power of truth and the courage of those willing to uncover it. Judge Malcolm Brewer had spent decades believing in the system, trusting that the law would always lead to justice. He had sat in countless courtrooms, listened to testimonies, weighed evidence, and handed down sentences with the conviction that he was doing the right thing. But he had been wrong. The system had cracks that men like Detective Lewis had learned to exploit. And for the first time in his career, Brewer had seen just how deep those cracks ran. He could have walked away. He could have ignored that flicker of doubt the day he signed Ryan's sentencing papers. He could have told himself that he had simply followed the law, that it wasn't his responsibility to question the verdict. But justice isn't about following the rules. It's about questioning them when they no longer serve the truth. It took courage for Ryan to survive years of wrongful imprisonment. It took courage for Brewer to admit his mistake and fight to undo it. It took courage for Daniel Hayes to dig into the corruption that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Because justice is not upheld by those who sit idly by. It is upheld by those who stand, even when they stand alone. Some called Brewer a hero. Others called him a fool. Some said he had weakened the justice system by exposing its failures. But the truth? The truth was that justice had never belonged to those in power. It had never been about the men in robes, the officers in uniform, or the lawyers who built airtight cases. Justice had always belonged to the people who fought for it. And sometimes, justice needed people like Brewer, people who were willing to break the system in order to fix it. Ryan's case was just one. How many others were still waiting for someone to listen? How many innocent men still sat behind bars, trapped in a world that had already forgotten them? This was not the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.